is to look at the founding period as well as all the way to the modern conversation around the impact that the criminal justice system has on our society, our citizens, and our world. Like I said earlier, my name is Curry Slotner. I'm the president and CEO of Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. We are a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to increasing awareness, education, and understanding of the criminal justice reform movement and its impact on our communities. Today's program is just the beginning of a new series that we've launched, so please check out more at easternstate.org. Now, a little bit about our speakers today. Professor Manion, Jen Manion, is a social and cultural historian whose work examines the role of gender and sexuality in American life. Manion is also the weekly professor of history and political economy at Amherst College, and they are also the author of Liberty's Prisons, the Carceral Culture in Early America and Female Husbands, a Trans History. Professor Manion, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And I will let you know, I am a bit of a super fan of yours. It was the first book that I bought as soon as I started being really interested in this topic and diving into this position. So thank you for my foundation and understanding the dichotomy we have in America and that tension we have in America with liberty and defining liberty and then also removing people's liberty. So we look so forward into helping us understand that time period in America and how it sets the stage, and we hear the patterns repeat over time. So thank you for being here. And Professor Jones, it's wonderful to see you as well. A little bit about Michelle Daniel Jones. She is the 6th-year doctoral student in the American Studies program at New York University. Her dissertation focuses on creative liberation strategies of incarcerated women in the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. As an organizer, collaborator, and subject matter expert, she creates opportunities to speak the truth to power and serves in the development and operation of task force and initiatives to reduce harm and end mass incarceration. Professor Jones, thank you so much for being here today. We look forward to you pulling us through the American history timeline and this focus on women and incarceration. So I will also nerd out for everybody, and some of the people that are in the chat know me very well. I'm a big fan of being a nerd, and I like to encourage it. This is a wonderful, another book that was like my second purchase here at Eastern State. So I am fanning on both of you today and just so grateful for the work and the knowledge that you have done to really unpack this story in American history. When I think about this program and March in general, we think about March, we talk about Women's History Month, and so often we come at these celebrations as a celebration for all great achievements that we have heard of. There are many, many more achievements that we have not heard of. But I also like to push us a little bit when we talk about these topics, whatever it is. Anytime there's a memory or a memorial, it gives you a chance, an opportunity to thank those who came before us, but it also gives you an opportunity to say, what is this moment telling me? And what has not been done yet? Where can I pull harder, open further, and learn more? And then personally, no matter who I am, take action to make change, make us live up to the ideals that we believe in. So we take this moment in Women's History Month to celebrate the past, but also to tell the stories about how we can make that change. And I will let you know that I've already been peppered with questions from an amazing group of 6th graders that are here in Philadelphia joining the program and really interested in understanding what is going on in incarceration around women. So maybe we can set the frame and set the idea for us to say, first, let's begin with maybe just the numbers, the stats. And I'm not sure if Professor Jones, you would like to, or Professor Manion, could you tell us a little bit about incarceration of women today and how many women are incarcerated? And what are some of those key factors of incarceration? Why are they incarcerated today? And Professor Jones, you're ready to jump in on this one, but you are muted, so I'll let you go.
And
Muted and then frozen. Okay. So we'll give her Professor Jones a minute to come back to us. Professor Manion, I'm right on that. You hear the
So
frozen
Megan
too,
can
right?
add in.
There.
Oh, go ahead. It
You were
seems
just frozen for a second.
yeah,
So
my internet is saying it's unstable. Maybe I shouldn't go first. I'm gonna try to move to another location.
okay,
Uh,
we'll give you a second. I'll set some framing and then I'm gonna ping it back to the time period of the 1760s, the 1780s, and what was going on at that time. Because what I have found so interesting about this is these echoes in history. And that we learn history for so many reasons, but for us to see patterns so we can make change. So when we look at the incarceration rate right now in America, we see about 180 to 190,000 women incarcerated in America. This is typically around 1/8 of the prison population. This is a significant amount of the prison population, but it also makes us want to unpack those numbers a little bit further. And what we're starting to see on that is an increase where we've overall started to see a decrease since the 2000s, 2020s in overall prison population. We've seen the opposite happen with women, that women's population of who are in jail or in prisons have been increasing. When we unpack that a little further, we start to see still women of color are overly represented in this number, but also even an increase in more in the last 3 years of white women in prison. So starting to unpack that will get us to the questions of why. Why are women incarcerated? Why have they been incarcerated? And what do we see the differences are? But before we dive into that modern conversation, Professor Manion, I'd like to turn it over to you to set that stage for us and help us understand what we're seeing in incarceration. How did it start in America? In this framing of liberty for the world, how do we see the removal of liberty in America?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's such an important question because all of us on this call right now have just been living through this era of mass incarceration, where the US just imprisons more people than any country in the world. And so I think I wanted to understand if that was a departure, how much that was a departure from, American cultural values and norms, or how much it was just a continuation and expansion of like long-standing views. The other idea that's commonly thrown around in early American history is around the moment of the nation's founding, that America's founding fathers were these enlightened, benevolent people who really wanted to move away from harsh forms of punishment that were common under British rule, such as corporal punishment and excessive capital punishment. And so that's part of one of the framings of where we see the introduction of incarceration, that this idea and the invention of the penitentiary, so that instead of punishing people's bodies for their crimes, you're going to lock them up, take them away from their families, isolate them, and try to put them through some kind of regime of reform, based on religious instruction or hard labor or denying them alcohol, denying them sexual intimacies, regulating their food, all these kinds of things. And I wanted to understand, what was like really going on in this moment. And is that because at first glance, when you look at it in comparison with corporal punishment and capital punishment, it sounds like maybe okay. Oh, it's part of an Enlightenment reform movement, where people are really trying to cultivate sensibility and sensitivity and, emotions. And of course, when I got into the records, what I found is not surprisingly the opposite of that, right? So just an incredible amount of cruelty, a lack of real opportunities for reform. And, a lot of people don't realize that, women were in the nation's prison and jails from the beginning. And, in my studies of Pennsylvania, usually around 20%. So it's not 50%, but it's not nothing. And from the beginning, women were treated as a problem because they really were never intended to be there in the eyes of, elites and leaders. For a woman to end up in prison, she sort of kind of got away. She ran away from enslavement. She ran away from her husband. She sort of got out from under the control of whatever patriarchal authority was responsible for her. And so the women who do end up in prison are treated terribly. They're treated as the worst kind of prisoners. And the reports are full of all of these kinds of jokes from prison guards and officials saying, like, I have 4 women under my care and 400 men. And those 4 women are so much trouble that I would rather have 400 more men. Like, it's just kind of this obnoxious, like, degrading, and this, and that women are just, whatever they do, they can't win.
Now, which is really fascinating. I started to dig into Eastern State. So from the beginning, Eastern State had this idea that they might have a section. So I am right now in Philadelphia in the penitentiary that Professor Manion was speaking about, this idea that came about in the early 1820s, that there would be a place of penance, a place that you could right yourself from your past wrongs and find your inner light. This, again, great concept, great idea, framed around solitary confinement, which they were aware was already causing severe mental health issues. And I was digging and unpacking some of the research our team did on this, which you can see those jokes, those comments, those statements of negativity towards women. Women, I don't want women here. Women cost twice as much as men. So when we think about this, they're already coming in with this strong negativity that they are a bother. They are a problem. They're even more of a problem than anything else. But women getting there in the first place, you talked about this in one of our prep calls, was around what are the type of women being put in the penitentiary or put in any jail in the first place? Do they start with that rationale to begin with? They're not the right women?
So, I mean, everyone is poor. Poverty is the #1 indicator that you're going to end up incarcerated in the early period. And in early America, that meant formerly enslaved African-American women. It meant Irish women who were indentured servants or servants who finished their indentures and then could barely survive. And some, immigrant Anglo women. So people are overwhelmingly immigrants and African-American. And the startling thing is that African Americans make up a very, very small percentage of the population in Pennsylvania in the 1780s and 90s and 1810s. But they're always overrepresented in the prison population. And by the 1820s, they literally outnumber the white women in prison. So one of the key findings from my research that is absolutely devastating is that long before, contemporary mass incarceration and all of these horrific statistics about the overrepresentation of Black men, is that in early America, Black women were the targets. Black women were never given the benefit of the doubt. They were not given pardons, and they immediately bore the burden of incarceration in America's founding. And so I think if I just say one more thing before I turn it over, it would be that we must grapple with the fact that just as Pennsylvania is moving to abolish slavery, they are building the nation's first penitentiary, and that we have to hold those two things together.
Thank you so much for making that statement. I really appreciate it, because we do. And this is what I find so fascinating about American history. It's never one narrative. It's never one single story. It's actually almost all the times things and dilemmas that are at odds with each other. And one does not negate the other. We hold on to both of them and hold them at the same time. And that is such an important reason why we're in this conversation together today. Really great questions coming in with the chat, and we will pull those through. But Professor Jones, I'd like to turn it over to you. Your research on the Indiana women's prison is so fascinating and layers on top of this story as Eastern State in Philadelphia is defining liberty and pulling away from liberty, not just for America, but in all honesty, and not to be American-centric, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, was a document that was echoed around the world in the 1880s. I mean, the 1780s into the 1790s. So we're seeing this across the world. And you have this two dilemma pieces of people trying to do something better, but at the same time, things not getting better. And that is what I found so fascinating about your book and the first women's prison in Indiana. And that's the first women's prison in America. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So yes, historians consider the Indiana Women's Prison, which is called now, but it was called the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls, the first prison for women in the United States. And it was Quaker women who founded it, and it was constructed during the, right before the Progressive Era. So after reviewing and discussing the existing historical and contemporary accounts, I mean, retrieved for us by our non-incarcerated teachers and librarians and friends, we were initially believing that we were writing the feel-good story of the year, a story about two powerful Quaker women banding together with other Quakers and state officials to create a safe and rehabilitative environment for women in need, right? After all, our major protagonists, Rhoda Coffin and Sarah Smith, the founders of the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls, which opened in 1873, they were coming from a background of service themselves, right? So with that, with their belief system as devout Quakers and prison reformers, Smith and Coffin were like at the forefront of the prison reform movement to save the so-called fallen woman and the so-called wayward girl from the clutches of designing men. Which were the guards and the wardens at the Indiana Jeffersonville prison for men in the South, because the women were incarcerated with them. They experienced so many sexual violences and abuses in that place. There were children born in the female department of this Jeffersonville prison. So they were organizing to save these women from the clutches of this male prison facility. Particularly Smith and Coffin and the state of Indiana, they were fighting against these debaucheries that happened to the women in Jeffersonville, and which they felt to be, which they represented to be a research on Indiana's good name, is how it was sort of framed. Coffin herself and Sarah were at the forefront of reforming creating other reforming institutions, such as the Home for Friendless Women in Richmond, Indiana, the Home for Friendless Women in Indianapolis. The initial framework for these women were that they were deviant women who were out of place in terms of their social and cultural norms. And so they actually had to, in order to redeem them and reform them, they had to be incarcerated to do that. So as we began to understand the gist of the existing scholarly work, including Dr. Manion's work on, incarceration in general, and then Indiana history in particular, questions began to form in our minds. Our experiences as incarcerated people doing this work, incarcerated women doing this work, left us with a profound awareness of power imbalances. Our insight began to provoke questions in our minds regarding the prevailing and dominant narratives of who's incarcerated and why, and who's creating these prisons. A component of this included our personal knowledge and experiences of the destabilizing effects of unfettered power over incarcerated people. Also, while not much is written about incarcerated women and girls in Indiana Women's Prison or in Indiana history at all, we felt what we were unearthing a subjugated knowledge. We thought we saw this book as offering a counter narrative, or a narrative to sit alongside dominant narratives. Our perspective as incarcerated women allowed us to ask questions that expose the meta-narratives of benevolent prison reformers and that movement. And our findings were that, that movement is incomplete and simplistic, and it didn't really consider what was happening to the women inside, right? So our first challenge to the standard story of the prison's founding came early. We learned that in our records that not one woman was convicted for a sexual offense in the first 24 years history of this prison. Yet that was what they went to the governor to demand, that what they considered the prostitutes in Jeffersonville to be removed, to create a separate prison for these fallen and ruined women. Tracking the makeup of the women's prisons population, sort of made us suspicious. How could the reformatory not incarcerate the very women who Rhoda and Smith claimed so desperately needed a separate facility? We pressed our outside researchers to look again. Eventually, we discovered that a Magdalene Laundry ran by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd had opened in Indianapolis a few months before the Indiana Women's Prison and housed women convicted of sex offenses. The reformatory staff and the Sisters of the Good Shepherd of Indianapolis had agreed that the reformatory would get all of the murderers and thieves as such, or those people in those type of conviction histories, and that the sisters would get the women convicted of sex histories. And in our Indiana history, stories about the Magdalene Laundries and these workhouses, these Catholic-run workhouses, is pretty much has not been written in our state. So we saw researching this a major intervention in our Indiana history. And of course, we learned that they worked in very punitive conditions. They were supposed to figuratively and literally wash away their sins. Magdalene Laundries are commonly associated with Ireland, but as we discovered, they flourished in the United States as well. Magdalene Laundries and not the Indiana Women's Prison. Magdalene Laundries, we consider today the first private prisons for women, and the Indiana Reformatory Institution, we consider the first public prison for women. Indeed, by the 1900s, there were 39 of these private Catholic prisons for women in the United States, and only 3 state prisons, including the Indiana Women's Prison. These discoveries in this research was super, super important to us. We later went further with the research to look at the conditions of confinement specific in these places. And we learned, particularly my colleague Anastasia Smith, she discovered that the man elected president to the American Medical Association in 1876, the renowned Dr. Theophilus Parvin, was also providing medical care to the women and girls in the prison in its first decade. Given how inadequate medical care prison is in prison today, it seemed exceptional for a person occupying a post as prestigious as the AMA to have worked in a prison. Anastasia discovered very early on that Dr. Parvin used his position at the prison to conduct experiments and surgeries on the women, often without their knowledge or consent. 3 years after he resigned from the reformatory, Dr. Parvin published an explicitly illustrated obstetrics and gynecology text based on what he learned from operating on women and girls in the reformatory. So within nearly 10 years of unfettered access to 125 women and girls a day, he used their bodies to further his field and career. This is important research for people to understand about the overall makeup of this carceral institution, and begin to pull some of those red threads through, right? Lastly, I just want to lift up a form of newfangled convict leasing, which we called the ticket of leave, which was called the ticket of leave system. Prisons, and particularly women's prisons, were struggled to be self-sufficient. It was always this idea that if you're going to have a prison, it must be self-sufficient. It shouldn't be a burden on the taxpayers of the state. Well, it was tremendously hard for women and girls to do that in the facility because they were taught domestic vocations, sewing, knitting, laundry. It often wasn't enough to keep the facility running. So in addition to selling handiwork like gardening and farming and handicraft like cane chairs and socks and operating a laundry, the facility practiced a form of labor exploitation with a euphemistic name, the ticket of leave. The board, and I'm quoting now the board on this, the board adopted the ticket of leave system for the government of the reformatory. When, in the opinion of the superintendent, it becomes proper for a girl to be allowed an opportunity to again make her way in the world, the board grants her discharge conditional upon her good behavior. She thus remains a ward of the institution without expense to it, and may be returned at any time upon her evidence of a want of reformation or a lapse from good behavior without a new commitment. Girls chosen for the ticket of leave were the most trusted and indoctrinated into the ideals of the code of domesticity. They would leave the reformatory on an early form of probation and then sent to labor in the homes of friends and associates of the reformatory staff in this domestic service enterprise. Used to reduce the institution's population and therefore the cost of operation, this convict lease ticket of lease system represented a way for the prison officials to profit for incarcerated labor while looking like a method to reintegrate women into the workforce. It operated as a method to keep young girls tethered to the prison as a ward of the institution without expense to it. This meant that young girls labored in their home, in these people's homes for their keep, their food, meager clothing, and a bed, no salary for themselves, yet removing the cost of care from the prison. Yet, as far as we can tell, the prison still charged each county a conviction for the women for their incarceration. So, this is just a little look into this work, but there is a motivation behind these female benevolent prison reformers. They were charged with creating the first. And so any failures within the institution would not be allowed, right? And so they thought they were removed. We thought the women were being removed from very violent places like the sexual assaults and things happening in the men's facility. But in order to maintain and control these women and girls, they used certain very violent methods to control them, such as beating them and ducking their heads in water with a form of waterboarding called ducking. They hosed them down. They denied them access. They knocked their heads against the wall, and often unclothed in sort of sexualized physical punishment. Our positions as incarcerated scholars, however, pushed us to examine these power relationships at work that brought Sarah and Coffin's ultimate exonerations after these investigations. We discovered that both women were tremendous political operators, and therefore, these institutions, an idea of them benevolence, they were holistically wrapped up in politics and governance and social control due to their relationships with legislators and governors. So that's a little bit about that. And I just like to say that, the nature of our research, coupled with our prison experience, was essential to synthesizing the context of the 1881 investigation, as well as the condition of confinements that the women were involved in. We know and have personally experienced corruption, sexual and gendered violence, psychological violence in prison with no recourse or accountability from prison officials as well. So that was a red thread that we could literally pull through time to our own lived experience today.
Thank you. That was unbelievably powerful, and so many pieces that we really need to unpack and understand. But I'm going to go through them kind of piece by piece. And I want to actually start with both of you as historians and as researchers. Michelle, you just really teed that up so unbelievably powerful. When you have an experience, when you have an understanding from your own personal viewpoint, you're able to hear the stories of the past in different ways than other people. Can you share, and then Jen Manion, would you share next kind of your perspective of how you go through the process of doing that research? It also just makes me really want to echo the idea that so much of these conversations that we're having is about what can we do next? What is the future going? That also means ensuring that people with lived experience are at the table listening to other people going through those experiences. You can't hear it unless you know what you're looking for sometimes. So tell me a little bit about your research and your work moving forward and how you've used that to kind of unpack the past in a way that other people have not been able to do in the past. And then Professor Manion, over to you.
Yeah, I think that myself, and as well as the rest of the colleagues who have been working on this project have felt personally galvanized by our ability to pull the red threads through from our lived experience. And of course, in the book, I developed a methodology around that practice, which we're calling the embodied observer, that our lens and perspective of captivity is a tool in which to examine a carceral archive. But like pulling on some of those threads, I just want to pull, the idea of eugenics and medicalization and experimentation on the captive, then is forced and coerced sterilization in women's prisons and inordinate lengthy sentences that keep women captive during their reproductive years now. And that's a red thread. The ticket of leave I talked to about, and training in domestic labor and pushing for marriage then is in-house convict leasing programs where factories are being brought into prisons so people can labor in the prisons, programming deficits, and the lack of comprehensive reentry supports designed to stop recidivism and stabilize people's lives. Focusing on reforming the white criminal class then, and using prisons as a tool of social control for Black women is then today is like reinforcing that group difference inside the prisons. And in my own personal experience, it's resulted in the fact that Black women had to file a lawsuit to gain access to clerk jobs in the prisons, higher paid jobs, such as in the law library, because even behind bars, white women might have lost access to full privilege due to criminality, white privilege due to criminality. But even on its hobbled legs, it operated to provide them access whenever possible over others to opportunity behind the walls. Secondly, Indiana was focusing on reforming the white criminal class in the 19th century, and that is still their goal, particularly when you know that white women in our state was the highest population incarcerated in prison while I was there, and has increased since the opioid crisis. Yet the face of women incarceration in Indiana generally is a Black woman, right? Of women's incarceration. Incarcerating young girls in prison with adult women is as they did in the reformatory. They put one side of the prison was for adult women, the other side was for women and girls, and I mean little girls, because they were fallen or ruined by society's standards and needed to be punished. Then is directly related to the school to prison pipeline now, and it essentially states that women and girls need to be incarcerated to be helped, right? And so this is important to think about in terms of this resurgence on the tough on crime that's happening now, right? And what I have experienced in my own lived experience, because I was incarcerated during Clinton administration, that as these tough on crime policies come in, our conditions of confinement plummet, our access to resources and opportunity and programming plummet. And so, and my last statement I want to say about that before I pass it to Dr. Manion is that, like Pell, right? It was gone for 20 years. It's back now, but it was taken because some legislators decided that incarcerated people did not deserve access to a higher education. So Pell's back and we're celebrating, but we need to be mindful of the fact that it is just as fragile now as it was then, and maybe even more so with the particular turbulent conditions that we're living in. So thinking about how to fund HEP in prisons, higher ed in prisons without Pell, as a couple of schools like the Bedford Hills Correctional Program has been able to do, is critical. And so I think I'll pause there and let Dr. Manion speak.
Dr. Manion, I might give you a couple options to go to next. So would love to hear kind of your thoughts on perspectives about diversifying our historians and ensuring that voices of historians are coming from all different perspectives, but also just to echo some of the amazing, powerful statements that I heard you in your opening piece and Michelle in the last piece. It's this right to have your body. It is the right to be one and in safety with your body that women are over time being in more and more danger over, and more power from the government. And thank you so much for bringing up eugenics, because when we unpack this, we have to really understand, it's not just this story that we hear that happens globally, but we look at our own constitution and our own government, and heroes of the Constitution like Oliver Wendell Holmes and some of the cases that come down about the right to your body, let alone for incarcerated women, but also incarcerated women who are impoverished as well. But it's also when you talk about the jobs and making enough money to be able to not just pay for your incarceration, but to then leave the incarceration and have a job that gives you a living wage is the right to economy. And then we look through the right to thought. In so many of the stories you both have shared is women being not just incarcerated, but then abused in different ways and oppressed in so many ways while incarcerated because their right to thought does not align with social context and construction. And that goes all the way through from just living to be who you want to be to the Pell Grant and your right to education. All of this for me is really wrapped around this mindset of this is freedom. You can only gain and regain and recapture your freedom if you have the ability to yourself, to your thoughts, and to an ability to be free financially. So Dr. Manion, you can go any way you want at this piece and kind of pull these ideas together for us.
I think I just have two different points I'd like to make. One is, in terms of personal experience and personal identity as a queer transgender person, I've always been interested in, seeing the role of the carceral state in, regulating our identities. It's very hard to find in the long ago past a lot of people incarcerated for cross-dressing or transgender or being queer were often classified as vagrants. So there's a lot of issues of record keeping, especially the farther back you go, that ends up erasing our experiences. So we're already silenced, people don't really have a voice in the records, but even a lot of particulars about why people were there. But we have better records now, we have better data. And so there's, I think it was based on a 2011, 2012 report, there's quite a number of studies right now that show how of incarcerated women, almost a majority of them identify with the LGBTQ community. So some of the statistics, it's over 40% who've had some kind of, LGBTQ experience in their life who are in prisons, and in some of the studies, it's 30% who are in jail. So people who are gender nonconforming or in some kind of same-sex relationship before they entered prison, it's an overwhelming statistic. It's even more dramatic number for queer women of color and completely disproportionate, to our existence in the larger society. So when I hear women in prison and people think mothers and reproduction, I think it's important to think LGBTQ, because that is not a statistic that carries across to the male prison population. And, and this, let me just say one thing that connects to my larger point. There are moves to create special prisons for trans women or for LGBTQ people because of the special particular kinds of violences that they experience. And that is one terrible example that has existed throughout all of American history, that when there is an example of violence and mistreatment and abuse inside prisons of a group or a person or whatever, and there's an investigation and there is enough outrage to warrant political concern and news reports, it always, to a T, results in the expansion of incarceration. Always. And so that's how we get women's prisons in the first place, was to protect female inmates from male guards and male prisoners. And then you get, as Michelle so beautifully unpacked in 20 different ways, everything that goes terribly wrong and how, women are mistreated in these women's prisoners. So if I could just throw out, a thing, for maybe the Q&A is, it's when it's really hard to feel good about reform when you know how reform and reformers have worked to expand incarceration in this country. And so, some people differentiate between, say that we have to be mindful of the idea of reformist reforms that perpetuate and empower and embolden the system, and abolitionist reforms that might offer particular help or remediation or, improve somebody's quality of life and basic human rights and bodily autonomy and bodily integrity while they are incarcerated, while moving towards, reducing, minimizing, and ending the system itself.
And thank you for unpacking that for all of our viewers too, because the understanding of what abolitionist means through time is sometimes, it's one of those words for our younger viewers that the word, you recognize the word, but you also need to unpack it. And I think that's really fascinating when you look at that and you say, yes, reform everybody can get behind, but at the same time look at the outcomes of reform and what's the negative impact of it. So let's break that down a little bit, and I'm going to weave some of these questions in here as well, because we are on the Q&A kind of promised time of it. But so much of our prison population, we're looking at 40 to 44% of the prison population, or the incarcerated people in America, have mental health issues. And we know there's a higher rate of sharing with leadership in incarcerating settings that women have mental health issues. So really kind of help me understand what is happening in prisons around this issue, and how a reform is really about addressing this before people become incarcerated. So Michelle or Jen, up to you, who wants to jump in on this first.
Yeah, I would say, and you're absolutely right. Okay, so because there's always the trauma that leads to the incarceration. Then incarceration is traumatic in its own right. And then the trauma of attempting to reentry is to reenter society with all of its collateral consequences and its no's and its the defragmented families and the lack of funds and access to equitable resources. So yes, we all know that there is a divestment from community supports in every budget everywhere in order to fund capitalist expansion and building projects and development for economic accumulation and development for profit entities in each state. So the local supports that help people coming home are just not there, right? And then there's all the traditional stigma around seeking help, particularly in the African-American community. I have a therapist, but there was a time when I wouldn't be proud to say that because there was such a stigma wrapped around those things. And also when you think about how impact with the criminal legal system can sometimes result in self-devaluation, where we begin to devalue ourselves as individuals, and therefore we don't fight for all that is our rights, or we don't push for things because we don't feel we're worthy of it. It's a big issue for women who have caused harm in the world, right? And so supports for that definitely should be front loaded. And I mean, honestly, if we're not talking about this at secondary education level, then we're missing it completely, right? Because by the time a child is unserved in the family, right, you can't wait until they're a teenager in high school to try to deal with some of that, or if they're unserved in the community, you can't wait until they're an adult to try to deal with that. Our community needs many more supports at the grassroots level in the neighborhoods, and schools used to play a role for that. I remember going to school because my mother was we were poor, getting seeing the dentist at school. There was much more attention around what does this child need to be successful, right? As opposed to waiting until something inevitably breaks and you've got DFS involved and you've got the law enforcement involved. We need to be working much more early than that. And then inside, I mean, I wrote an article about this. The privatization of health care and mental health care leaves incarcerated people unserved. In a facility of 630 human beings, while I was incarcerated, there were 2 mental health professionals, one dedicated to a special needs unit of 60 and one for everybody else. When we understand that trauma is really what happens to us, is really causal right there about why we even end up in prison, then why would the answer be one human being in a prison left over for 580 other women, to work on their stuff? I mean, So the carceral state does not assist us. They don't help us. They're underfunded. They don't provide what we need to make it out. And then on the other side of that, a lot of us don't have the funds to pay for a professional, right? $200 an hour, $150 an hour. I mean, who can do that, right? And some insurances don't cover all that. So the line of lack of support all the way through for mental health care for women in particular, but all folks who are impacted by the criminal legal system, particularly the LGBTQ community and involved in that as well, trans community as well, because their experience in prison is even worse than that of women. Yeah, we're woefully underserved in those spaces.
And I think you both have done such an amazing job today, kind of showing us this tapestry of impact, that it isn't, you know, one story, one person, one identity, but these layerings of information, and also at the same time, layerings of action that we can take. And Michelle, thank you so much for breaking that down too. It's like, we should be examining, as citizens today, we should be examining what is happening in our K through 12 systems, in our schooling systems, in our, you know, our elementary systems as well, because we're seeing that mental health crisis in the K through 12 systems. And we're rolling back in America the supports around not just high quality education, but mental health supports. So how are we naturally building this pipeline into prison, not effectively supporting and giving people what they need while in prison, and then the reentry programs and the lack thereof support systems? It goes back to so many people's questions about what is the difference between men and women's prisons? What is the difference between ages in women's prisons, from young children, young girls to adults? But so much of this really falls back on this understanding of how do we really shore up an America we want to be a part of and engage in, at the same time that we hold on to individuals' liberty. Jen, I'm going to turn it back to you. And this question, I think, that started us off and ends us really well today. And then I have one final question after that for both of you. But this idea of when the Quakers decided, you know, in both of these scenarios, to create some kind of reform, what was that Enlightenment theory? What was that idea holding on to? And is there something we can pull from that idea and hold on to today?
Well, it's funny because, as you know, Michelle was talking and you were just like, what's the America that we want? I was thinking, well, universal health care, more funding, you know, for K through 12, free college, and then job opportunities. And, you know, most of this would go away. So, you know, we're moving in the opposite direction on most of those issues. But if I were to try to distill like some of the Quaker intent at its best, it meant those things, right? So some of it was, you know, to give people the space to heal. You know, they might not have used that word, but that is kind of what it was. You know, they wanted it to be in a particular religious way. But that was an idea for the early penitentiary, to regain your health. So they're going to, you know, feed you certain foods and not let you have access to other foods, to study the Bible so that people could become literate. And, you know, the workshops, I don't know, I wouldn't stretch and say that was ever about economic opportunity, because that was always, you know, about exploitation and, you know, covering the cost of the institutions. But I do think you could say that some of the original impulses, if they were actually brought to life in a real way, you know, would go a long way into addressing the problems of why people end up incarcerated, why this system has become so big, why we're a society that even tolerates it, as opposed to creating other alternatives for people.
And I think that's really a powerful thought, is hold on to kind of the big value and move that through, instead of the actions that were taken were not effective. So if we hold on to give people a space to heal and time to reclaim themselves, empowering people to do their choices for themselves, but then economic freedom as well. Michelle, help our, you know, we have students of all ages on this program today. It's really a fascinating gamut of different classrooms, different adults, lifelong learners, college students. We can do something. This isn't just a moment in the past that's affecting us today. We can actually do something and take action. Could you our students that are listening from all ages are all around the country. What are some of the things they might be able to do to take action to unpack and right our system?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm a community organizer, and I just really believe that when we get together and we bring a diverse group of people together who bring all of their talent skills together, we can do anything. I'm kind of an idealist in that way. And so I would say some actionable steps is surrounded around community organizing, creating communities of care, developing strategies of care and service. And some specific organizations that I can talk to that do that, for example, around higher ed in prison is Join Unlock Higher Education. Unlock Higher Education is a national organization. And what we do is we empower our local states representatives to talk to their legislatures as constituents, as formerly incarcerated, directly impacted, concerned folks in the community about these issues, right? Take them directly to the lawmakers. And Unlock Higher Ed is a way in which we get to do that. We're actually having a Hill Day this week in DC, where we're going to talk to our legislatures about issues around higher education and Pell and the needs in the community. Other organizations I would say that were important for people to tap into is the National Council for Higher Education and Prison Conference. That's bringing together all kinds of students, educators, practitioners in the field, community organizers to talk about issues and theorize and think together about solutions. And then you're in your own local community, right? You can do a Google search of community-based organizations that serve this population specifically, and you can sign up, become a volunteer, check out their websites, go to one of their meetings, come alongside them with your dollars and your time. I think that when one strategy of care, when we're talking about creating community care service, is to get involved and participate and bring your best self. And so those are just a few organizations to think about, to come alongside. And I think the biggest thing here is to getting change with our legislatures, getting change there with the bills that impact us so directly. And you can do that by participating in organizations that are focused on that, like banning the box and other legislative changes that will bring more equity for us. And I don't know, I'm just get moving. I just want to say, get moving, get talking, engage with people. Don't wonder, ponder, get in conversations. I email people all the time and say, hey, I'd like to ask you some questions about these things. Get in conversation. You will find out so much more than you thought you knew by talking to the people who are doing the work on the ground and reading their books. Buy their books and read their books, because that's another way to get involved with this work. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I think that was perfect. It's so important. I love that you bring up these communities of care. It's communities of belonging as well, that we realize that this is our community and that we belong together and that we build together when we reach out and support each other. But I love the idea of ending this with read their books, both of their books, because they're really powerful, and be curious and wonder and ponder and ask questions and unpack all that. It's so unbelievably powerful for us to remember that the human dignity that each of us have, and that we represent that in each other and give people place and space to pull that together. Professor Manion, do you want to leave us with any final words on these pieces? But nope, you're good. Thank you. I'll give you a second to Professor Jones, Professor Manion, this is a fantastic program today. I appreciate you both so much, really enlightening me and understanding so much of our history and how we see these patterns, but also ways that we really can understand how to break these patterns as well. So for all of our students in the class, including myself, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the great work that you did on both your books. People online, we'll make sure we share that with all of you and your students, and students of all ages, thank you so much for your great questions too, because they really help us frame this conversation. Thank you, everyone, and have a great Monday. A hot second there, I forgot what day it was. It's Monday. Thank you both so much. That was a fantastic conversation.
I hope so. I hope so. I'm sorry I was late. My your link would not allow me to open up Zoom unless I logged in with the same email that was sent.
Oh, yeah.
But my own personal
Great.
Zoom account is under Michelle at Constructing Our Future, my business. And I had to go create a Zoom account in that email, get it logged in. And it was just like, what is going on here? It would not let me open it. And I tried it in directly from my email. I clicked it into the browser, Safari browser. Then I tried Chrome browser. I just was not getting
I'm so sorry. That's like so nice and fun and stressful to walk into.
I was like,
And I was
oh
like,
my God.
Professor Manion, we're going to start with you. I am perpetually